got the current value of 0. I just pushed record back so I can see that.
Wait, so breaking the Sabbath
Lost there.
also was punishable by death?
Yeah, probably.
Just looking toes there. Huh?
Yeah.
You provide that.
Yeah.
One. Wait, one
Racism.
Oh, racism.
Couldn't it be a subset?
Just take one slope.
You have to be more
Anthony.
racist without being for slavery.
Well, thank God we're going to have a non-controversial topic. So after today's session, you might want to take a break, do some exercise to relax yourself. Huh? Yeah, we are going to enter into very another controversial topic, and however, the teaching is very straightforward. Racism and immoral discrimination. Immoral discrimination and racism.
That's part of the title.
I don't know if everybody ought to know what they, yeah, please keep going.
Should we pick one for later?
Yeah. One, just pick one. What about the other one? No, I don't need one yet. No, I just want to make sure that this is going, the handout, is it enough?
What do you do?
The handout of the prayer, I don't know, can't find it.
There.
Yeah, that's right.
Oh,
Yeah, who hasn't got, yeah, please keep moving around. Please pick one for him.
Yeah.
Yeah?
Okay.
Never mind, you gave it back.
So who? Oh, okay. Please, pick one, yeah. I don't know how I to get back to that. Otherwise, I'll shout somebody in the prayer. So that's the last copy. Oh, okay, good. Thank you. All right. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We say the prayer together. Dear Heavenly Father, you created us in your own image, to dwell in the likeness of one another. Help us to know you more, and to love you just the way you are in all of us. Help us to appreciate the gifts and blessings you have given to each one of us, to share and to celebrate in the lives of one another in love. Even in the moments when human differences creep in, help us with your grace to always overcome such divisive temptation that prevents us from living without the love for one another and the loving company of those whom by the accident of birth we feel that they are not like us. we deliberately neglected or failed to encourage to live out our responsibilities as Christians. In our daily lives, may we bear with your Son the gifts of joy, and we bring the fruits of your friendship to those who can't be beyond the boundaries of our shores. Lastly, at the end, may your lasting peace nourish us with an abundance of grace, so that the more we love us, the more we love one another, and the more we love one another, the more your world becomes a happy place for all of us to grow into unity, in peace, and in love. Amen. So, I just want to put a caveat. The video you're about to watch is very disturbing. And just for you to know ahead of time that in case, just for you to know on time that it's disturbing.
It doesn't work that way. Because you have it connected to the computer, you have to use the mouse.
No, that one.
Oh, you have that one set up that way?
Yeah.
How disturbing is this? Do I need to?
Yeah, please keep guiding me.
This morning I have a special presentation I want to share with you in public. I want to warn you in advance, the DVD you're about to see is exceptionally graphic. In all probability it's going to make some of us uncomfortable, and it should. I'll make it very clear, we did not produce this DVD. It was produced by a young man who is watching us today over the internet. His name is Reginald Bullock. He's watching us from Tennessee. The DVD speaks for itself, but let me set it up for you. But did you know that black teenagers are killing each other in rising numbers? And it is part of a troubling trend that is plaguing our communities and this nation. Our young men are disappearing either because they are being killed or because they are headed to prison for killing each other. Now, those statistics don't frighten you, and I want you to take a very sobering look at this DVD, because as I have been saying, you have to change your heart in order to change your hands. And Madam President, would you please, this is about an 18-minute DVD, and I know our attention span, in many cases, people like to move around. But please, I want you to please watch this DVD and give it your full attention. So,
Robert Kennedy, when he was Attorney General, said that he could imagine the possibility of a Negro president in the United States within perhaps 40 years. Do you think this is at all realistic?
I am very optimistic about the future. Frankly, I have seen certain changes in the United States over the last 2 years that surprised me. So on the basis of this, I think we may be able to get a Negro president in less than 40 years. I would think that this could come in 25 years or less.
When the bombs fell on our harbor and tyranny threatened the world, she was there to witness a generation rise to greatness and a democracy was saved. She was there for the buses in Montgomery, the hoses in Birmingham, a bridge in Selma, and a preacher from Atlanta who told the people that we shall overcome. Yes, we can. A man touched down on the moon. A wall came down in Berlin. A world was connected by our own science and imagination.
Sir, Master of Darkness, I came to apologize. I know that you gave me control of the African Americans on Earth, but I messed up, sir, because one of them has just been elected President of the United States, sir. I'm so sorry, sir.
Quit crying, you fool. You must have forgotten what I have done to African Americans throughout the history of time.
But Master of Darkness, he's Harvard educated. He's smart man. He's a good man. He loves his wife. He's almost like he's perfect. And he's a Christian. It's going to be really hard to stop him, sir.
There are certainly ways to stop him. Let me give you the history of what I've done to the African American. I always knew that I needed America to be a powerful nation that would control the world. But in order to do this, I needed Africans to help accelerate the process. Having slaves in America would allow the United States a 300-year head start on all other nations, allowing them to become one of the most powerful in the world.
Why did you pick African slaves, sir?
Africans were very strong people. They were one of God's first creations. I needed their strength. I needed their wisdom. I needed all of their abilities so that I could help the Americans become powerful.
How did you get him to do it?
We beat them. We whipped them. We did everything we could to destroy who they were. We even sold their children, broke up their families. They don't even know if they're related or not, even to this day. But one of the biggest things that we did to them was we destroyed their spirit. And one of the ways we destroyed their spirit was to change their names. You see, Africans were very proud of who they were, what tribe they came from, and pronunciation of their name. But you see, we changed their name. We made their captors give them new names. What's your name?
Kunta Kinte.
I want to hear you say your name. Your name is Toby. What's your name?
Kunta.
What's your name?
Toby.
Hi. Say it again. Say it louder so they all can hear you. What's your name?
Toby. My name is Toby.
Hi. That's a good nigger.
So Grandmaster, that broke the spirit of the African American?
No, not immediately. Because you see, the African American always had a connection to his God. His God has always been in his corner. And when he listened to his God, he's always seemed to pull out of situations. But I'm always there to correct this. You see, African Americans, once their names were changed, they then became proud of their new names. They went from Kunta Kinte to Bill Jones, Toby Smith, and even names like Robert Johnson. And even when I called them Robert Johnson, it didn't seem to stop them. They continued to achieve success at every level, and this was very frustrating to me in my dark hours. So I thought my plan failed, but I came up with a new plan, and my new plan was to call them all niggers. That's right. I don't care if you were Kunta Kinte. I don't care if your new name is Robert Johnson. You are a nigger, and I want the rest of the world to look at you as a nigger. You see, a nigger is someone that is nothing, that is below everyone else on the planet. You are close to being a dog.
So Master Darkness, once you called them niggers, they just accepted it?
No, you fool. They did not accept it the right way. It took a while. You see, once again, they went back to their God, and their God carried them through the 30s and the 40s and the 50s, and we called them niggers. We put ropes around their necks, and we lynched them, and we hung them from the highest trees we could find.
let their bodies swing in the night. We burned their homes. We created groups called the Ku Klux Klan that absolutely terrified all living African Americans. Once again, they withstood the pressure of time by praying to their God, to their Jesus.
Well, Grandmaster, what did you do then?
I forced evil's hand. I told evil to make it so that African Americans couldn't vote. I made it so that African Americans could not sit in front of a bus. I made it so that African Americans couldn't get a proper education. I did everything I could do, but they continued to pray and pray and pray until one day, oh, God heard them, and he gave them heroes, people of substance. He gave them Dr. Martin Luther King. He gave them Rosa Parks. He gave them Malcolm X. He gave them all of these freedom fighters, and they fought and they prayed, and it was one of my darkest days.
Well, how did you deal with their heroes, Grandmaster Darkness?
Very easy. I murdered them. One by one, I killed King. I have a dream today.
Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis.
I killed X.
What is your real name? Malcolm X. My father got his last name from his grandfather, and his grandfather got it from his grandfather, who got it from the slave master.
I killed Medgar Evers. I killed a little boy, Emmett Till. I killed 4 girls in an Alabama church. I killed all of them.
So Grandmaster, is this the direction we should go with their new president?
No, you fool. You see, we don't have to kill them anymore. African Americans have been beaten down for so long, they simply kill each other. Let me explain it to you, my son. You see, African Americans in their 20s and 30s and 40s and 50s would be hung, would fight to the ground if they were called nigger. But you see now, I've got them affectionately calling each other nigger. They call their husbands nigger. They call their wives nigger. They call their little children, get over here, you little nigger. They love calling each other nigger, and they think it's cute. I've got their spirits broken, and I have young African Americans embracing the word nigger. They all think they are niggers, and they say it with a smile on their face, even though their grandmothers and grandfathers were killed for the word, but they have said it in name and music, and people call it warfor. I call it my nigger control. I've got them thinking that entertainment, basketball, rhymes, these are more important than coming to school on time. They think that's all they can do. So you see, they never focus on education. And the sad part is, when you see a young black child in school that's trying to strive hard, the rest of the black kids make fun of him. They call him a white boy. Isn't that a masterful, wonderful mind trick that I play with them? But listen to me, my son. There's even more mind tricks. They think that thug life is wonderful. They think that thug life is keeping it real. And they think jail life is funny. Oh, we've done a job on the African American. But let me tell you the worst thing that we've done to the African American.
Oh, this is getting good, Grandmaster Darkness. Tell me more, tell me more.
I am so powerful that now I have everyone afraid of African American males. No matter how old they are, people are afraid of them. They're clutching their pocketbooks. And do you know why? African American men are really perpetuating the fear that I've placed in people's hearts. They're selling drugs to each other. They're selling drugs to children. They're recruiting their own children to sell drugs. And do you know what the consolation prize is? You get to go to prison and hang out with all of your boys. for the next 5, 10, 20 years. And if you're lucky, maybe you'll get a bullet in your brain and be able to leave this earth early. That is the hopelessness that I've given young African-American boys and African-American girls. I've turned them into hoochies, hoes, bitches. That's what they're called. Oh yes, in their music. Oh, it's a beautiful day to destroy African-American spirit because they don't know they were the kings and queens of the earth, and they cry when they see Barack Obama, but they smile when they're called bitches. They don't know. Oh, I've got a plan for them.
Oh, what's the plan? What's the plan?
Oh, my plan is simple and sweet. Just keep them uninformed. You see, the slave masters from way back in the day, they knew there was a secret behind keeping African slaves to not have any type of education. Well, that's the same thing I'm doing, but we don't have to have laws now. They don't show up at school. They don't care about grades. All they care about is shiny hubcaps. They care about shiny things on their hands. You see, all you have to do is give young African-American youth just shiny things. They're like babies. Don't you worry about Barack Obama, because they will cry. They will feel happy. But once the joy, the happiness has subsided, they will go back to selling drugs. They will go back to shooting. They will go back to infecting each other with diseases over and over again. They will go back to hiding away from their God. Their new God is money and bling, and nothing else matters. And as a matter of fact, Barack Obama in 4 years will be a laughing joke, because people will say, you had a black president, and look at you. Your ghettos have increased. Your hopelessness has increased. Your teen pregnancy has increased. Your godlessness has increased.
Oh no, Grand Master. I left my intergalactic cell phone on. Everything we've been talking about is being transmitted back to Earth.
Don't worry, my son. African Americans are too distracted to know that it is us. They will blame white people. They will blame the police in their neighborhoods. They will blame their neighborhood. They will blame their father for not being there. They will blame their mother for being an alcoholic. They will blame their lack of money. They will blame everything around them except taking personal responsibility and realizing that I am the evil force behind all of their troubles. Even if they were to hear this message, they wouldn't believe it. They would blame someone else.
Depression across the land. She saw a nation conquer fear itself with a new deal, new jobs, a new sense of common purpose. Yes, we can.
Alone in a room, it's just me and you. I feel so lost, 'cause I don't know what I'm going.
When the bombs fell on our harbor, and tyranny threatened the world, she was there to witness a generation rise to greatness, and a democracy would say,
They had about 4 minutes more
I'm so
to
afraid,
get to the last part of it, which
afraid of
I
disappointing
don't know
you.
if just explain that I was writing it.
Talk to you and ask you for
Want the rest of the 4 minutes?
especially this day
Keep going.
when my life is so cloudy. Guide me.
So, I don't want you to lose your attention. Things could get a little bit boring. So the voice of the master you are hearing is racism. That's the voice of the master. They will go out saying, you fool. So that's racism that's making those comments. Please come to Macedonia and help us here. Can somebody help me?
Are you trying to get back to your computer?
Yeah.
Click on input. Input.
Down the middle.
In the middle,
Oh, okay.
bottom. Click input, then click the
Right.
right-hand corner
Okay,
display.
thank you.
No, just touch it. There you go. Now you're on that computer.
Please log in.
Control.
Who logged in?
password is visitor.
Oh, thank you. So, I want to begin with, pardon my ignorance, I'll be messing things up a little bit, but just bear with me. It looks tiny.
No, you have the slideshow.
Slide.
Where?
Way up on the top. Over. Up. Now go to your right.
Here?
Yeah, that's fine.
Yeah, go back.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Start from the beginning, click it.
Oh, thank you. You guys are awesome. Thank you. So, racism and discrimination is our topic today, and we are looking at the mid-20th century. I'll be moving back and forth, so and feel free to interject and ask questions in between if you want. So, it started with back mid-20th century racial classification by American anthropologist Carlton S. Kuhn divided humanity into 5 races, which we can see as Caucasoid, white race, Negro, black race, Capoid, Bushman, or Hotento's race, Mongoloid, Oriental Amerindian race, Australoid, Australian Aborigine, and Papuan race. Then I want to begin with another question. What is racism? When this video, short clip was going on, I'm sure will be, those things are not new to us. We've heard about all those stories, they are not new to us. So it's just that I reawaken those experiences into our consciousness again. So it says racism is the belief in the superiority of one race over another. It may also mean prejudice, discrimination, or antagonism directed against other people because they are of different race or ethnicity. Modern variants of racism are often based in social perceptions of biological differences between people. So, the intention about racism is not because people don't believe that these are just human beings, no. But the climax, the highlight is just about superiority. That is the highlight of it. The superiority, claim of superiority. Who is in charge? Who is most powerful? Who is smart? Who is this? Who is that? So that is the most important focus about everything you can see about racism. And then it comes in so many forms: prejudice, discrimination, antagonism, and then in little ways it permeated into the society and every fabric of the society. Then I also try to distinguish between the two terms, that is racism and discrimination. Both of them are not mutually exclusive. They are like mother and daughter. So racism's means of action is discrimination. So discrimination is when someone is treated unfairly or differently. Discrimination is also when a person is treated unfairly or badly because the person is one of a particular group, which we have seen.
It's in fact, we're talking about immoral discrimination. Like, for example, when, for the just war theory, when you combat and go to war, you are called to discriminate between combatants and non-combatants. That's a good discrimination, you see? But this is an immoral discrimination. So racism is a type of immoral discrimination. So,
thank you, Father. That's wonderful. So as time goes on, racism continued to permeate into the human society, into the fabrics of human society, and started taking all forms of shapes, all forms of actions, all forms of attitudes. So one of them, which I am trying to look at, is institutional racism, also known as systemic racism. Is a form of racism expressed in the practice of social and political institutions. It is reflection in disparities regarding wealth, income, criminal justice, employment, housing, healthcare, political power, and education, among other factors. So,
having said that, I'm glad you have that definition there. One of the problems I have with the video is that it's all focused on the responsibility of the individual, which is, I think, is part of that. The African Americans are not, they're not taking responsibility, which is, I think, is part of that, maybe. But this is an institutional racism, so which means there are structures that have nothing to do with whether or not an individual wants to come out of that situation, because the structure doesn't let you do that, you see? And I think we can name some of those structures. So that is an institutional racism. So I just want to make sure that's something I didn't see in the video. That's why I want to highlight it. So,
thank you.
Since you're on the computer, you gotta use your mouse here to go down.
Oh my goodness.
oh, you use the
Use the keyboard, just hit the down button. That'll work.
the arrow.
Okay, so fact sheet on racism. Brief history. While racism is partly a result of fear and ignorance, the origins of racism are to be found in history. Slavery was not an invention of the Middle Ages. It had existed for more than 1,000 years, but it started to become a more organized trade towards the end of the 14th century, when the Europeans began to take people from Africa against their will. Then we look at roots of racism. The slave trade originally developed because of the growing demand for sugar, which lasted in Britain for about 150 years. Irish merchants were part of this trade. By the early 19th century, Britain was one of the richest slave trading nations in the world, with large numbers of slaves being transported from African and Asian colonies to Europe and America. Triangular trade. So while these movements, while the Europeans were making all these moves about slave trade, they created a situation called triangular trade, whereby the Europeans will go to Africa and they have textiles and all kinds of stuff. Textiles, cigarettes, gunpowders, and then they send it to Africa. And these African people, whoever the contact person they have there, will gather all their people and tell them, let's go to the farm. And the next moment, you're being taken to the sea, to the nearest seaport. So that was what my grandmom told me. So people were missing in communities. People would leave and they won't come back. So that was how they know. They never knew that they were going to Europe. And then when they get people from Africa, they take them to either the Caribbean or to the United States, and then have them in exchange for cigarettes, silk, and all kinds of stuff. So let's just read on. A trading system known as the triangular trade was created to obtain sugar and other goods. Ships left Bristol, Liverpool, and London carrying textiles, gunpowder, silk, and other goods. These were then traded in Africa for slaves. The slaves were taken to the Caribbean and America to work on plantations, where they are exchanged for sugar, cotton, spices, and rum. Imagine. These goods were then taken back to Britain and sold. Over 30 million people were taken from West Africa, my country included, very unfortunate, and sold into slavery. They were transported in horrific conditions, often beaten and mutilated, with 1 in 5 failing to survive the journey. Those that did survive could only expect to live another 2 to 4 years. So bad were the working conditions in the plantations. Many slaves tried to escape or rebel, and even suicides were a daily occurrence. Black myths and theories. Many people were horrified by the brutality of the slave trade and wanted to stop it. This led the people who supported it to develop theories to justify what they were doing. They claimed that some slaves had caught a rapidly spreading diseases, the symptoms of which made the slaves run away. Blacks were naturally lazy, people were told, which is why they hated working in the plantation. Defenders of the slave trade also said that blacks were less intelligent than whites. They were subhuman and had thefts. These ideas were backed by church leaders, writers, and academics, and soon a large number of myths about black people were spread about Europe. The African slave in America was happier than his own civilization. Slavery supporter quoted in C.L.R. James, the Black Jacobins. The common characteristics of racists and bullies. I was looking at the characteristics, what a typical racism looks like, or a racist. And then I was looking at who is a bully. And then I found out that both of them had one common feature. So, a racist, anyone who by acts of intimidation, prejudice, discrimination, or hatred treats another unfairly because of their color or ethnicity. Then, a bully. In the 1500s and 1600s, the word bully meant an excellent person. Nowadays, bully usually means someone who hurts those weaker than oneself. Unfortunately. So, and remember, racism is all about power and control. So,
just one question. So far, you are connecting racism to the Black and African American experience. Now, is there any other type of racism?
Yeah.
You're gonna talk about that?
Yeah, I'm going to talk about it. That's what is in the second slide you have. What does the church say about racism, about race and racism? First of all, there are three dimensions or more, but I'm focusing on this. Biblical dimension, ecclesial dimension, and social dimension. The first is, according to Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, the fundamental message of sacred scripture proclaims that the human person is a creature of God and sees in his being, in the image of God, the element that characterizes him. God created man in his own image. The second one is, Jesus was a refugee in Egypt. If he had encountered discrimination, we wouldn't have been here today because King Herod would have chopped his head off like the holy infants. So, I'm trying to look at the biblical dimension, why, what the church looks at, race and racism. Then another one is the ecclesial dimension from the church, from the USCCB. It is the responsibility of every society to ensure that human life is protected at all costs, as we heard in the last presenters on capital punishment, from the moment of conception until natural death. Racism is an evil that endures in our society despite significant advances in the recent decades. It cannot be denied that the ugly external features of racism that marred our society in the past have in part been eliminated. At the same time, however, it must be acknowledged that too often what has happened has been only a covering over and not a fundamental change. The sin of racism defiles the image of God and degrades the sacred dignity of humankind revealed in the mystery of incarnation. Then on the social dimension, the relationship between God and man is reflected in the relational and social dimension of human nature. Man, in fact, is not a solitary being, but a social being. And unless he relates himself to others, he can neither live nor develop his potential. So if we're able to follow first the social dimension of racism, we will appreciate what the biblical dimension talks about. Because the social dimension means we cannot do without one another. And then we are doing that because we are appreciating the fact that we are all made in the image of God after God's likeness. And then the symbol that our Messiah had an experience, but he was not discriminated, makes it all important why the USCCB.
How do you know he was not discriminated?
The scripture said Jesus had, Joseph and Mary took Jesus to Egypt so that King Herod wouldn't kill him. And after that, they came back.
So he experienced discrimination.
Pardon?
He did experience discrimination.
Oh, thank you, Father. So, did you hear that Jesus was discriminated?
Well, we don't know that for sure.
No.
We can't say one or the other because it's not in
Right.
scripture, but we can assume he probably did.
Probably did,
Well, we know he was a baby boy.
He was a baby boy.
As a baby
and they
boy,
were
he
all
was
being-
discriminated because they killed all baby boys.
Yeah.
Yeah, and we don't know the real reason why he couldn't find a place to stay.
Yeah.
We don't know.
Yeah.
So major areas of racial divides. So,
Sorry, just a comment. There was a lot of racism at the time of Jesus. Again, the Samaritans, for example. They could recognize the Samaritans just by looking at them.
even with the Romans, too, the Roman government against the Jews also, they have discriminations too. I don't know. So, major areas of racial divides. So I was looking at in the church and in the state. So I'll give you the context why how I extracted this. What I did was to find a way to connect it with all the presentation that we have here. So we'll get back to that later. So conformity to social pressures, stereotypes, and ethnic prejudices. So, sorry, I'll come back again. In the church, we have conformity to social pressures, stereotypes, and ethnic prejudices. And then lack of conversion to the image of Christ, lack of sensitivity and silence over the inhibitions of economic, educational, and social progress of the poor caused by injustice and divided social structures. Lack of interest in witnessing the spiritual gifts of those from diverse cultural backgrounds, and in fostering vocations among minority groups. Undocumented minorities and the use of stringent laws to keep them away from applying for jobs at Catholic institutions. Lack of leadership and faith-based programs to encourage effective leadership among cultural and ethnic minorities. Active spiritual and financial support to be given to associations and institutions. Lack of active spiritual and financial support to institutions or associations organized by minorities for the promotion of ministry by those communities. Then within the state, we have disproportionate national life and welfare plan from one generation to another. Employment opportunities denied to minority groups, housing patterns and lifestyles between major cities and suburbs, ever widening gap between the rich and the poor, disproportionate and unfair treatments of minority populations by law enforcement, legal and justice system, stereotypes, marginalization, and insecurities. Let me just put a highlight on some of these things. I don't know if any of us have been to a minority community